Welcome back to Get Down to Business. So I've been thinking a lot about this question. What constitutes a successful career? And we know that that answer may have dramatically changed over the last 50 years, but the journey people make as human beings across different life cycles, well, it's eternal. And that is exactly what our next guest, David Oxley, writes about in his new book, A Career Carol, a tale of professional nightmares and how to navigate them. David Oxley, welcome to the program. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I know you are the veteran of leadership and management, many different leadership and management roles, and that's exactly why I wanted to bring you on to this program. David, for starters, I mean, how did you develop sort of a passion for this topic? It's a really awesome title, A Career Carol.
Well, I suppose there's two ways to answer that. The first is, how did I end up working as a leadership coach and working in the human resources space? That's a story of how careers unfold somewhat unexpectedly. But I started as a management consultant and then ended up going to work for a couple of big companies. And for different reasons, I ended up running their human resources functions. And you end up realizing pretty early on that the best way to help organizations perform is to help individuals be the best versions of themselves, to overcome their own obstacles and barriers. And ultimately, that's what I've spent the last 20 or 30 years doing, so much so that I was so fascinated by this nature of human beings and how we perform that I ended up doing a doctorate in it just to punctuate it and get all the academic background. I know that sounds terribly boring, but actually it was very interesting. And so that's really sort of the background that led us to eventually and somewhat reluctantly writing the book.
It doesn't sound boring at all. I mean, I think it's great. Again, a tale of professional nightmares and how to navigate them. You wrote this title, and I think it's a little bit of a take on the Charles Dickens classic. So you've got a little bit of jokes in there as well. So let's talk about again, navigating careers past, present, and yet to come, and what A Career Carol is really all about.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. We wanted to have fun with it. That was probably one of the three central tenets that we agreed. About a year and a half ago, we had been having ongoing conversations about the people that we were trying to help. My writing collaborator, Dr. Schuster, is working with a number of young entrepreneurs across Europe who had started their own businesses, and we often talked about how we could help them overcome their challenges. And their challenges were sort of these personal challenges of how they could be effective, how they could go about making their businesses more successful. And we kept coming back to, you'd have the conversations with these people and then find that they'd say, well, is there something I can read that would reinforce these points? And we found it very hard to find something that fitted that space. A lot of the literature on careers and leadership sort of are somewhat dated now, 20, 30 years old. And the context has changed. So the first thing was to try and fill that gap. How do we write something that would appeal to a Gen Z, next gen population? And the answer to that question was, let's have fun with it. Let's make it a story. Let's make it something that would be entertaining to read and not a tough read. So that was the first tenet. And the second thing was, how do you make sure that you're true to yourself, that a lot of the Gen Z population that we've been talking to are very concerned that careers are leading them to sort of be someone that they're not, to be inauthentic, to mold themselves to what this sort of job market expects them to be rather than what they want to be. So trying to help people navigate that. The Charles Dickens Career Carol, Christmas Carol, just beautifully fit in with that narrative, the idea of you're sitting there the day before your graduation, wondering what your career is going to be like, and then you get visited by these four ghosts that foretell what is ahead and give you a story of the nightmares that you need to be careful that you don't end up falling victim to.
Absolutely. And we know that career advice has been spoken about quite a bit over the past number of years, especially, again, as we've gone through a recession, and then certainly over the pandemic, we've seen all sorts of crazy times up and down. But one of the things that I find interesting, again, in a career carol is you talk a lot about how to maximize return from a career. And one of the things that you promise, again, it's in the title, A Tale of Professional Nightmares and How to Navigate Them, is you highlight some, through humor, some real stories. And so I'd love to hear more from you, David. What was some of the inspirational stories that you were able to capture in this great read?
Well, thank you for that. I hope other people agree with you that it's a great read. The four big nightmares that we captured, the inspiration behind them is the social science behind and this gets into the nerdy piece, the social science of us as human beings and how our lives mature over the space of 40 years, the different phases we go through, and how that intersects into your professional life. It's very difficult to separate careers from, the nature of human beings and how we mature. So we very much looked at the nightmares and the stories as the intersections of these things. And then we thought about how it would be great to get characters to really amplify the point. So the first one we have is this failure to launch. And I just love the idea of using one of these classic American football coaches to come back as a ghost. And there's a sort of Yogi Berra component to some of the quotes he gives in that first section. I think that, for me, was a real fun part of the story.
Absolutely. Well, David Oxley, we're going to have to leave it there for a moment. We're going to come back and continue our conversation. When we return on Get Down to Business, lots more from a career carol, A Tale of Professional Nightmares, and how to navigate them when we return on Get Down to Business in just a moment. Welcome back to Get Down to Business. So we know that what constitutes a successful career, frankly, it may have dramatically changed over the last 50 years, but the journey that people make as human beings across different life cycles, it's eternal. In fact, just as I was preparing for this conversation, somebody asked me on the street at the coffee shop, they said, "What do you do?" And it led me to ponder that question. What do I do? Is it what I do professionally? I know our returning guest over here, David Oxley, the author, co-author of A Career Carol, A Tale of Professional Nightmares and How to Navigate Them, talks a lot about this. So David, welcome back to the program. Thanks again for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So lots of career advice in this book, but there's humor, there's stories, all sorts of things. How would you say that things have changed over the past, I'd say, 5 decades?
I think that's a great question. And if you're trying to give people career advice, and you may be similar to us in the sense that there are a number of people who say, well, you seem to have done reasonably well or you've been reasonably successful. Tell us the secret. And the difficulty of answering those questions is it's very much anchored in the context that you started your career 40 years ago. Careers were fairly analog, and the idea of networks and personal relationships really mattered. Where you went to school really mattered. And so if you're giving career advice in a way, it's difficult to bridge that, what we call the analog-digital divide that now people take just as a sort of commonplace, that you can get jobs online through LinkedIn and other sources. So what we feel is important is to try and drag it much deeper into the sort of emotional component, what we call the intrinsic drivers of individuals. What makes you happy? What are you good at? What makes you fulfilled? What's your identity? And how do you try and link that to your career? Because the big challenge is that you wake up in your 30s and 40s and say, how did I end up here? This is not making me happy. I've ended up in a place I didn't really want to be. So being tethered to who you are and your identity is really important. And I think that's the best career advice you can give people.
Absolutely. David, this is a really important conversation at all times, but especially now as we enter into the end of the year. I find that it's a time when a lot of people are pretty introspective and starting to look at, again, are they happy? But especially this next gen community is constantly looking at, again, how they can have that purpose, how they can define ambitions and dreams. And you talk a lot about this in the book. So, David, I only have time for one more question before, of course, we get our listeners in touch with you and the ability to pick up a copy of this great read. But what are you seeing and hearing from your next-gen collaborators that I know inspired so much this book? What are some of the common themes and trends that maybe weren't true when you started looking for a job?
Great question. Yes, just to amplify the point, that we had about 10 or 12 next-gen entrepreneurs that contributed to the book, and so their views make it a bit of a multi-generational perspective, which we thought was important. And the key thing that came across time and time again was the dangers of getting swept along in your early career by other people's expectations, by comparison to what other people are doing. You know, I want a great job, and I'm not sure what a great job really represents. So I compare myself to other people and then start to compete with them. And the problem with that is that it's very often the wrong thing for you as an individual. So the thing that came across time and time again is just be sure that whatever direction you're going in is really good for you as an individual, is really good for who you really are.
Well, I don't want to share all the secrets because I know folks can read a lot more in your book and get in touch with you and your co-author. How can we do that?
Well, we are available now on Amazon for pre-orders for the book. So the most obvious thing is for people to go out and buy a copy of the book. That'd be great. But in addition to which, we have a website, drsschusterandoxley.com. You can contact us via that, and we're on all of the big social media platforms.
Fantastic. David Oxley, really appreciate you coming on, enlightening us in this conversation. Can't wait to bring you back on again real soon. That's a wrap for us here on the show, all about small business, jobs, and entrepreneurship. Get on my website, syklein.com. I love to hear from our listeners. And be sure to subscribe, rate, review, and share on your favorite podcast app. To success, let's get down to business.